Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to the Lindbergh Curse, a mythic history of America's crime of the century. The sky was his kingdom. Long before he was called a hero, Charles Augustus Lindbergh dreamed of the air as if it were an ancestral homeland. As a boy in Minnesota, he would climb barns and silos, staring upward at the passing clouds, convinced that somewhere beyond them lay a destiny carved not in stone, but in sky. His classmates called him odd, even cold, but there was a strange certainty in his movements, as though invisible hands were guiding him. By 1927, the world knew his name. The spirit of St. Louis, that silver bird of aluminum and rivets, carried him across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. 33 hours of solitude, with only the drone of the engine and the whisper of fate at his side. When he landed, crowds surged forward like worshippers greeting a demigod. For them, Lindbergh was not just a man, he was a modern Icarus who had flown and survived. Newspapers called him the Lone Eagle. Children studied him in classrooms. His face appeared in shop windows, his name in hymns of progress. But progress always carries a shadow, and some whispered that no man flies so high without offering something in return. In the old countries, the lands Lindbergh's ancestors left behind, stories endured of the Norns, 3 women who wove the threads of fate. They gave kings their glory and heroes their hour, but they also demanded payment. The gods are jealous, the old sagas said. They lend greatness only to reclaim it. In taverns and kitchen firesides, Norse immigrants whispered of Lindbergh as if he were marked. The sky gave him a crown, they muttered, but the sky always asks for blood. Some said the child of the air would never keep a child of his own. Of course, such tales were dismissed by journalists and politicians. America was a land of rationalism, invention, and steel. Yet deep down, beneath the hum of radios and the glitter of electric light, myth never truly left. By 1932, Lindbergh was no longer just an aviator. He was the guardian of a dynasty in the making. He and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, had built a secluded estate in Hopewell, New Jersey, high on a hill above pine woods and meadows. To the public, it seemed idyllic. The hero had married a poet, and together they had a son, Charles Jr., a golden-haired child who represented the future of the nation. But the house had an aura that unsettled visitors. Tall, isolated, it loomed against the sky like a fortress watching over shadows. Servants whispered of strange drafts that carried voices in the night, and hunters in the woods claimed they saw a great raven perched on the rooftop, silent and watchful. Anne would later write in her diaries that the land itself seemed too quiet, as if holding its breath. And the child, barely 20 months old, often woke screaming at nothing visible, his cries carrying out into the forest, where they seemed answered by unseen echoes. Charles Lindbergh adored his son, yet there was an austerity in his love. He was a man carved of discipline and logic, a scientist's mind in a soldier's body. He believed in order, in control, in the triumph of will over chance. But children obey no such laws. Charles Jr. was fragile, plagued by colds and restless sleep. The great aviator who had conquered the Atlantic now found himself helpless before the mystery of infancy. Neighbors said Lindbergh walked the estate at night, carrying the child against his shoulder, gazing into the sky as though asking it a question. Why give me the world, only to leave me powerless here? In myth, such questions never go unanswered. On the night of February 12, 1932, a storm swept across New Jersey. Branches snapped under the weight of wet snow, and the wind howled like hunting wolves. In the nursery, Anne claimed she heard tapping at the window, though no branch grew close enough to strike the glass. When she went to check, she found the baby calm, staring upward, his small hand reaching toward the ceiling as if grasping at invisible threads. The next morning, a neighbor reported finding a dead raven on the road near the estate. Its wings were spread wide, black feathers glistening with frost, its eyes glazed over, yet strangely unmarked by injury. Old German farmers shook their heads. In their lore, a raven dying without wound was no accident. It was a harbinger, a messenger silenced because its warning was too terrible to speak. As February slipped into March, the estate seemed wrapped in unease. Anne's diaries tell of dreams in which her child was carried away by figures cloaked in mist. Charles dismissed them as nerves, yet even he was unsettled. One evening, as he worked in his study, he thought he heard a ladder scrape against the outer wall. Rushing outside, he found nothing, only the moonlit woods, silent except for the rustle of unseen wings. That same week, Lindbergh received an anonymous letter praising his gift from the heavens and warning that such gifts never came without a reckoning. The letter was unsigned, and though Lindbergh filed it away as the rambling of a crank, he could not bring himself to throw it out. Thus stood the house at Hopewell, poised on the edge of myth and history. The aviator who had touched the sky, the poet wife who saw omens in dreams, the child who cried at shadows unseen, all woven together in a tapestry neither science nor faith could fully explain. And far above, unseen, the Norns of old were said to whisper, "The debt is due." For fate is not patient, and greatness never comes without a price.
The night of March 1st, 1932 fell upon Hopewell like a shroud. The wind carried the scent of rain-soaked pine and frost, and shadows pooled in corners of the estate as if waiting. Charles Lindbergh had retired early, weary from a day of meetings in New York, leaving Anne and the baby in the nursery. The house, normally a sanctuary, seemed alien in that darkness, as though some invisible presence had claimed it. Inside the nursery, Charles Jr. slept lightly. His small chest rose and fell in rhythm with the ticking of a mahogany clock. Anne had checked the locks twice, ensuring the baby was safe behind doors bolted against the world. But safety, she would learn, is often only a human illusion. A faint creak echoed from the hallway. The nanny stirred but thought nothing of it. Then another sound, softer, deliberate, like footsteps cushioned against the wood. Outside, the wind flung the ladder against the side of the house, or so it seemed. In truth, it had not fallen from the barn. The shadows themselves appeared to move elongating toward the nursery window, converging like the hands of a giant clock, counting down a moment no one could escape.
The first news of intrusion came in whispers. Neighbors spoke of a figure cloaked in black, slipping through the woods near the estate. Some described a pale, almost spectral face. Others swore the figure seemed to vanish into mist when approached. No one knew whether it was man or spirit, only that it carried with it the unmistakable aura of menace. In ancient tales, such beings were called changeling thieves, Fae who replaced human children with shadow doubles, leaving parents haunted. The rational minds dismissed these stories. Even Anne felt the prickle of old wordless fear as she heard the faint rustle of the wind brushing against the nursery window.
By dawn, the horror had fully arrived. Charles Jr. was missing. A simple ladder, a single window unlocked, and the child was gone, vanished into the night as though the shadows themselves had claimed him. On the kitchen table lay a note, crude and scrawled in shaky ink. "We have your son. He is safe. Follow instructions or the boy dies." Charles Lindbergh, normally a man of precise logic, felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. This was no accident, no petty crime. It was as though fate itself had breached the walls of his home.
The ransom demand was enormous, $50,000 in gold, a king's ransom in 1932. But to those attuned to whispers of old, it was more than money. Gold has always been a strange metal in legend, attractive to mortals, cursed by the gods, able to draw greed and misfortune alike. Old Norse tales spoke of treasure hidden by Loki, left to tempt kings, bankers, and commoners. Those who took it were marked. Some whispered that the gold Lindbergh was asked to gather carried such a curse, that anyone who held it would find darkness following them.
The Lindberghs enlisted detectives and local police, but clues were scarce. Tracks disappeared in the snow. Dogs refused to follow scents past certain points in the woods. Some claimed they saw a shadow flit between trees, too fast to be human, yet undeniably present. Local myth spoke of sky ravens, enormous black birds that tracked the living and warned of death. Witnesses claimed to hear flapping in the treetops long before sunrise, circling and watching. Charles, dismissing the superstition, wondered only how a human could vanish so completely. Yet in the quiet of the pine woods, even his rational mind shivered.
Months passed. Charles Lindbergh, desperate, followed instructions delivered by a mysterious intermediary, a man calling himself John Condon. The gold was left in a darkened cemetery, a tableau of human and supernatural dread. Lanterns flickered. The night felt alive with intent. When the money was gone, so too was the child's trail. Yet the act of handing over the ransom seemed to awaken something older. Witnesses later spoke of shadows stretching unnaturally, twisting against moonlight, as if the forest itself were alive and attentive. Some locals swore that the wind carried whispers that night, promises and warnings in voices that were neither male nor female, young nor old, voices that seemed to echo from time itself. As the investigation deepened, neighbors reported oddities, faint cries in the woods, glimpses of figures standing at the edge of the tree line. A farmer found a ladder, not broken, but eerily clean, as though placed for the convenience of some unseen purpose. Even the Lindbergh family could not explain it. A psychiatrist later suggested the stress of the kidnapping might cause hallucinations, but Charles and Anne, along with some detectives, knew better. Something beyond human malice had touched their lives. Whether fae, curse, or fate, the night had been claimed by shadows.
The first investigators were frustrated, but old families in Hopewell whispered among themselves, "This is no ordinary crime. The Lindberghs have drawn the gaze of powers older than our nation. The boy is marked." In Germanic legend, a hero's child who draws the attention of gods or spirits is often taken for a time, returned changed, or never returned at all.
People said Charles Jr.'s disappearance had the ring of these tales. His life, they whispered, was now tied to something far greater and far darker than mere human greed.
By the end of March, the nation was gripped by fear and fascination. Newspapers printed sensational accounts, photographs of the Lindberghs, letters allegedly from the kidnappers, and endless speculation. But amidst the frenzy, the shadows lingered. The wind carried secrets. Ravens, real and imagined, circled overhead. History would remember the Lindbergh kidnapping as a crime of greed and desperation. Myth remembered it as a night when destiny, long dormant, reached down from the unseen and whispered that every gift has its price.
The spring of 1932 had settled over New Jersey, but the chill of fear lingered in the air. The Lindbergh estate, normally serene, was now surrounded by a cloud of suspicion, sorrow, and whispers of the impossible. Charles Lindbergh, the hero of the skies, had been humbled, forced to navigate a world where neither skill nor fame could shield him from darkness. Amid the chaos, a quiet figure emerged, John F. Condon, a retired school teacher from the Bronx. He offered to act as intermediary between the Lindberghs and the kidnappers, a bridge between reason and the irrational. But Condon's arrival carried its own peculiarities. He seemed to sense more than the facts presented to him, noticing subtle changes in the air, shadows that moved where none should exist, the odd flutter of ravens in the periphery of his vision. Some said he had an intuition almost supernatural, the kind that could discern the invisible threads of fate. To the Lindberghs, he was a lifeline. To the unseen, he was a pawn in a far older game.
The kidnappers' letters continued to arrive, each more cryptic than the last. Written in shaky ink, with the occasional smudge of gold dust, the notes seemed mundane, yet carried an eerie cadence. The boy sleeps. Obey, and he will remain so. Disobey, and shadows will come for him. Anne Lindbergh trembled as she read these words, feeling in them the resonance of ancient warnings. In German folklore, notes delivered by unseen forces were signs that fae or spirits were involved in mortal affairs, omens not lightly ignored. Charles, ever rational, dismissed the mystical undertones, focusing on logistics, deadlines, and the precise counting of gold bills. Yet even he could not deny the strange certainty that the letters had a power beyond their ink. At Condon's direction, the Lindberghs prepared $50,000 in gold, gathered from various sources. The coins gleamed in the spring sunlight, dazzling and tempting. Yet legend whispered that such treasure is never without peril. Old tales spoke of gold that could summon envy, madness, and shadows. Coins once touched by mortal hands could attract the very forces of fate. In some versions, the treasure itself was alive, aware, and choosing its next bearer. As the night of the exchange approached, the estate felt the weight of unseen eyes. Charles and Anne could not sleep. Charles Jr.'s room remained empty, a cradle of echoes and whispered possibilities. Outside, the wind carried rustling branches that sounded like distant footsteps. The night chosen for the exchange was thick with fog. Lanterns swung from trees, casting ghostly light across gravestones slick with dew. Condon, carrying the gold, moved cautiously, sensing the air itself held its breath. The figure who appeared was both human and not. Shrouded in black, moving with deliberate calm, he received the gold with a nod. But as he stepped away, the fog seemed to ripple unnaturally, and the shadows of the trees stretched as though reaching for him. Neighbors later reported strange phenomena,
lights flickering in impossible directions, a cold wind that left frost upon the grass in defiance of the spring thaw, and an eerie silence punctuated by the call of a lone raven. It was as if the woods themselves were marking the transaction. Though the ransom was paid, the trail of Charles Jr. remained cold. Detectives searched tirelessly, yet tracks vanished in the woods, and clues led only to more questions. In whispered corners, townsfolk spoke of a figure glimpsed at the edge of the forest, pale, tall, and impossibly still. Some said it was a man. Others swore it was something older, a changeling or a spirit claiming its due. Even Condon, practical and careful, felt the chill of forces unseen. He began to believe that the Lindbergh kidnapping was more than a crime of men. It was an event where human greed intersected with fate, where shadows walked freely between the world of mortals and the mythic.
In the days following the ransom, strange occurrences plagued those involved. A courier claimed he was followed by a black bird for miles, always just at the edge of his vision. Condon's neighbors whispered of odd lights around his home. Even the police admitted, reluctantly, that the case carried an air of unreality, and they were men who prided themselves on logic. Some historians later remarked that the gold itself may have drawn misfortune, a reminder that coins once tainted by desperation are never neutral. In myth, such gold could summon shadows or spirits, a currency between human ambition and divine retribution. The Lindberghs continued to receive letters and cryptic messages. Occasionally, Charles Jr.'s voice seemed to echo in the nursery when no one was there. Shadows appeared to linger longer than light allowed. Ravens, real and spectral, were sighted circling the estate, as if keeping watch, marking the debt still owed. In private, Charles Lindbergh began to consider the impossible. Perhaps this kidnapping was not simply a crime, but an intersection of human malice and ancient powers, a reckoning summoned by ambition, fame, and the flight of a man who had touched the heavens. Detectives pursued leads with relentless energy, yet every path seemed to loop back into darkness. Witnesses contradicted each other, clues evaporated, and the figure in black remained unseen except for fleeting glances. As newspapers blared daily updates, Americans followed every development with fascination and dread. But those attuned to myth saw the pattern. Shadows moving in human form, treasure laced with consequences, and a child caught between worlds. In the quiet of Hopewell, the night pressed closer, the wind whispered, and the estate waited, patient and enduring, for the next act of fate.
The Lindbergh kidnapping, by mid-1934, had become more than a crime. It was a national obsession, a prism through which Americans confronted fear, justice, and the unknown. Newspapers printed every detail of the investigation, the letters, the ransom, and the rumors of spectral sightings. Yet outside the headlines, the shadows lingered, as if the estate and its forest were holding their breath, waiting for destiny to complete its design. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant with a quiet, methodical demeanor, was arrested in September 1934. He was found with some of the Lindbergh ransom money in his garage, his fingerprints on gold bills that carried the weight of tragedy and obsession. To the public, the case seemed straightforward, a criminal caught by diligence and luck. Yet in whispered corners of Hopewell, some said that Hauptmann had been chosen by forces older than the law, a mortal vessel for a shadowed fate. His quiet life had been disrupted, not merely by human investigation, but by powers unseen, drawing threads tighter around him. The courtroom brimmed with spectators, reporters, photographers, and everyday Americans thronged the gallery, eager to witness justice. But the air carried a tension beyond legal gravity. It was charged with something older. Observers reported unusual occurrences, sudden chills in empty corners, whispers of movement along walls, and the occasional shadow that seemed to flicker independently of any object or person. Some even claimed that, as Hauptmann entered the room, a black bird perched briefly on the courthouse roof, watching. The trial became a theater where history and myth intersected. Man judged by men, yet measured also by destiny. The prosecution presented meticulous evidence, ransom notes, marked bills, and the latter used in the crime. Hauptmann maintained his innocence, claiming he had no knowledge of the kidnapping. But legend has long taught that scapegoats often carry the sins of more than themselves. In folklore, a village may accuse one man of the misdeeds of many, or of the wrath of powers beyond comprehension. Hauptmann, whether innocent or guilty, became the human symbol of a debt owed, the vessel through which society and myth could enact judgment.
As the trial progressed, the gold seemed almost a character in its own right. Witnesses spoke of handling bills that burned with intensity, as though each coin whispered the names of those who had touched it. Some swore that, for a fleeting instant, they glimpsed shadows lingering in the corners of the courtroom, drawn to the currency as though it carried life and memory. Folklore teaches that cursed treasure never rests. It moves, seeks, and exacts tolls from mortals. In this interpretation, the gold was more than evidence. It was a ledger of fate. For Hauptmann, the trial was unrelenting. Witnesses testified against him, forensic analysis was presented, and every piece of evidence pointed toward guilt. Yet even as the world judged him, some felt he was caught in a larger design. In myth, heroes and innocents alike are often ensnared by forces beyond their understanding. They are pawns in games of fate, sacrifices to preserve the order of the universe or to balance the scales disrupted by human ambition. Hauptmann, whether guilty or innocent, seemed to embody this archetype, the man upon whom destiny had cast its shadow.
On February 13, 1935, Hauptmann was sentenced to death. The courtroom fell silent, yet outside, the wind seemed to echo the verdict, carrying whispers through the pines of Hopewell. Ravens circled overhead, their cries harsh and mournful, as if marking the conclusion of a grim ritual. Hauptmann was executed in 1936. History would record the facts, the crime, the evidence, the conviction. Myth would record something else, that the Lindbergh kidnapping was a collision of mortal ambition and fate, that a life had been claimed to satisfy a debt far older than human law. Even after the trial, the shadows did not fade. Anne Lindbergh wrote of restless nights, of dreams where her son wandered through forests of mist, unseen figures beckoning him. Charles Lindbergh grew more isolated, retreating from the public eye, obsessed with aviation, but haunted by a child lost, even briefly, to forces beyond comprehension. The estate remained as it had been the night of the kidnapping, a nexus of sorrow, vigilance, and whispered legends. Locals still told stories of lights moving in the woods, of voices carried by wind, of black birds circling where none should. The trial had ended, but the reckoning, the mythic echo of the night Charles Jr. vanished, had only deepened. The Lindbergh case left an imprint on America, shaping law, media, and collective fear. Yet beyond newspapers and statutes, there remained a story unspoken, a tale of shadows that walk between the seen and unseen, of a hero whose touch with the heavens invited consequences down to the smallest cradle, and of a child caught in the web of fate. History remembered the facts, Myth remembered the shadows, and the estate at Hopewell waited, patient, for the final act to unfold.
The shadows never truly leave. Years passed after the trial, yet the Lindbergh estate in Hopewell remained steeped in quiet unease. Charles Lindbergh, once the embodiment of human daring and technological triumph, now moved through life with careful precision. His flights became solitary ventures into distant skies, yet no altitude could lift the weight of unseen eyes. No speed could outrun the echo of that March night in 1932. Anne Lindbergh continued to care for her children, yet the family's harmony had been forever altered. Charles Jr. grew into a boy aware, at an instinctive level, of the darkness that had once claimed him. Nights were restless, shadows lingered where they should not, and even the family dogs refused certain corners of the estate. Charles and Anne rarely spoke of the kidnapping, yet their silence was heavy with unspoken recognition. The night had been more than crime, more than misfortune. Some part of fate had visited their lives, leaving an indelible mark. Lindbergh's accomplishments were lauded worldwide, yet the price of greatness had become clear. Legends teach that those who touch the heavens invite consequences for themselves and those they love. Charles had flown across the Atlantic, defied the impossible, yet a human child, innocent, fragile, had been the first to pay for the hubris of human ambition. Ravens still circled the estate, black wings blotting the sky like ink against paper. Anne wrote in her diaries that she often felt the presence of the past, the memory of a shadowed night, the whisper of voices she could not see. Even fame, they realized, carried its own curse.
Throughout the following decades, sightings persisted. Locals claimed to hear a child's laughter echoing in the woods, faint and fleeting, vanishing before anyone could reach it. Some reported lights moving in the forest at night, lanterns that seemed to drift without hands to carry them. In the folklore of the region, these were not mere memories. They were warnings, omens of the debt that greatness demands. The Lindbergh kidnapping had become a story not only of law and crime, but of fate, destiny, and the unbreakable threads that tie man to myth. Historians would debate the details of the crime, the guilt of Hauptmann, and the effectiveness of law enforcement. Yet myth preserves what history often overlooks, that events are never isolated, that shadows linger long after the facts fade, and that children sometimes walk paths their parents cannot see. The estate itself, silent and solemn, became a living testament. The trees whispered to those who listened, the wind carried the faint cries of memory, and the ravens, ever watchful, circled the grounds, reminding the world that some debts, once incurred, can never be repaid. Even today, those who pass near the old Lindbergh estate claim to hear a child's laughter or see a black bird linger overhead. Some dismiss it as imagination. Others feel the faint tug of history intertwined with legend. The Lindbergh kidnapping, a crime of flesh and blood, has become a story of shadow and fate, where history meets myth and the echoes of one night continue to haunt the land, a testament to the cost of ambition and the mysteries that dwell just beyond the reach of human understanding.